Marco Benedetti thought he was living the perfect fairy tale moment until Pope Leo XIV's voice shattered his wedding ceremony with a single, impossible word that would reveal secrets darker than death itself. The word "stop" exploded through St. Peter's Basilica like thunder from heaven, freezing 300 guests mid-breath and turning what should have been the happiest moment of Marco's life into something that defied every law of nature. Isabella Romano, radiant in her great-grandmother's pearl-encrusted gown, turned from her groom to stare at the papal figure emerging from the shadows near the sanctuary's edge. Her bouquet of white roses trembled in her hands as she tried to process what was happening. Father Benedetto, the elderly priest officiating, stood with his mouth half open, the sacred vows dying on his lips, like prayers cut short. Marco felt his blood turn to ice water as every nerve in his body screamed, "Danger!" The papal ring caught the morning light streaming through the ancient stained glass as Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, his weathered face bearing an expression of such profound shock that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral. The Pontiff's recent recovery from his heart surgery had left him gaunt, but his dark eyes burned with an intensity that made Marco's soul recoil in terror. "Your Holiness," Father Benedetto stammered, bowing quickly. "We were not expecting silence." Pope Leo XIV's voice was quieter now, but it carried the weight of absolute divine authority that had guided the faithful for decades. His gaze never left Marco's face, studying him with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime recognizing the impossible when it stood before him. "There is something here that cannot be." Isabella's confusion radiated through the cathedral, like ripples in still water. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the perfect acoustics of the basilica. Everyone heard the uncertainty creeping into her tone like poison through crystal. "What's happening?" Marco swallowed hard, tasting copper fear on his tongue. His collar felt like a noose as perspiration beaded along his hairline, despite the cool Roman morning. The congregation behind them had fallen into that particular kind of silence that only comes when the natural order has been violated. He could feel 300 pairs of eyes boring into his back, waiting for an explanation that would shatter everything they believed about life and death. Pope Leo XIV took another step closer, his papal robes rustling against the marble floor like whispered accusations. "Before these vows are spoken," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the sacred space, "I must understand how you can be standing here when I blessed your funeral 3 days ago." Pope Leo XIV's hand found the marble altar rail for support, his knuckles white against the ancient stone as the impossible recognition crashed over him like a tide of madness. The tremor that had plagued him since his cardiac episode 3 weeks ago returned with vengeance, starting in his fingers and spreading up his arm like lightning through his nervous system. He tried to steady himself, but the sight before him was more overwhelming than any physical ailment he had ever endured. Marco watched in growing horror. As the pontiff's face drained of all color, the congregation shifted uneasily in their pews, sensing something far beyond a simple ceremonial interruption. Isabella reached instinctively toward her groom, but Marco stepped back, his movement sharp and involuntary a gesture that didn't escape the Pope's penetrating observation. The pontiff's mind raced back to his private study just 3 days earlier, where Monsignor Toretti had knocked on his door with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Your Holiness," the cardinal had whispered, his voice breaking with grief, "there has been a terrible accident. Marco Benedetti, the young seminarian who was to be ordained next month, was struck by a tour bus outside the Vatican walls." Leo XIV remembered every detail of that moment with crystalline clarity. The way the afternoon light had slanted through his study windows, casting shadows across the mahogany desk where Marco's ordination papers lay waiting for his signature, the sound of Monsignor Toretti's sobs echoing off the ancient walls as he described the scene, the young man's body broken on the cobblestones, his distinctive angular features peaceful in death, the crowd of pilgrims who had gathered to pray over his still form. "I performed last rites myself, Your Holiness," the Monsignor had continued, his hands shaking as he placed the death certificate on the Pope's desk. "Such a promising young priest, taken from us just before his calling could be fulfilled." Now, staring at the groom before him, those same angular features stared back with desperate intensity, not peaceful in death, but alive, breathing, terrified. The distinctive cleft in his chin, the unusual amber-flecked eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, every detail exactly as Pope Leo XIV remembered from the broken body he had blessed in the Vatican morgue. "This cannot be," the Pope whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the cathedral's perfect acoustics. His legs threatened to give way beneath him as theological impossibility warred with the evidence of his own eyes. Isabella's confusion deepened as she watched the strange exchange between her groom and the Holy Father. "Your Holiness, are you unwell? You look as though you've seen the dead," Pope Leo XIV finished quietly, his dark eyes never leaving Marco's face. "I look as though I've seen the dead walking among the living." Marco's right hand moved to his throat in a gesture so automatic, he didn't realize he was doing it his fingers, tracing the small gold cross that hung there, a nervous habit that had defined him since childhood. The simple pendant caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass, casting tiny rainbows across the marble floor as his trembling fingers worried the familiar metal. Pope Leo XIV's eyes followed the movement with laser precision, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to absolute certainty. In the Vatican morgue 3 days ago, that same cross had been the only way to identify the mangled body, the distinctive medieval design, hand-carved by Marco's grandfather, a family heirloom that never left his neck. The pontiff had held that very cross in his hands as he administered last rites, feeling its worn edges where generations of Benedetti men had touched it in prayer. Isabella noticed her groom's strange behavior and placed her hand gently on his arm. "Marco Tesoro, you're shaking like a leaf," she whispered, her voice filled with loving concern. "It's just pre-wedding nerves. Everyone gets nervous at their wedding." But Marco's trembling had nothing to do with matrimonial anxiety. Its cold sweat gathered at his temples, despite the cool air flowing through the basilica's ancient doors. He tried to stop his hand from moving, to break the unconscious pattern, but the habit was too deeply ingrained. Under stress, Marco Benedetti always touched his grandfather's cross hand. Pope Leo XIV was watching every movement like a hunter studying impossible prey. "Perhaps the groom needs a moment to collect himself," suggested Isabella's father, Signor Romano, stepping forward protectively. He was a pragmatic man who had built his wine empire by reading people's tells. And something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong to his businessman's instincts. Marco forced himself to smile, the expression sitting awkwardly on his pale features like a mask that didn't quite fit. No, I'm perfectly fine. Just overwhelmed by the honor of His Holiness's unexpected presence." He looked directly at Pope Leo XIV as he spoke, hoping to project confidence. But his hand betrayed him again, fingers finding that familiar cross and clutching it like a lifeline. Isabella's maid of honor, her cousin Lucia, leaned close to whisper urgently, "Something's very wrong here. The Holy Father looks like he's seeing a ghost." "I'm perfectly fine," Marco repeated, his voice higher than usual and edged with desperation. But his eyes remained locked on Pope Leo XIV's face, searching for any sign of mercy, any possibility that this nightmare might end differently than the impossible truth demanded. The Pope stepped closer, his weathered hand rising slightly. "That cross you wear," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the cathedral's acoustics. "Where did you get it, my son?" The silence in St. Peter's Basilica became a living thing, pressing against the walls and settling into the bones of every witness like a physical weight. Pope Leo XIV's gaze held Marco with the intensity of a man who had spent decades reading souls, detecting lies, and recognizing the impossible when it stood before him. The pontiff's dark eyes, weakened by recent cardiac surgery but sharpened by divine wisdom, seemed to pierce through every carefully maintained pretense to something far more terrifying underneath. Marco's own eyes darted everywhere except toward the Pope. He studied the intricate marble patterns at his feet, the golden crucifix behind Father Benedetto, the nervous faces of Isabella's bridesmaids arranged like white roses beside the sanctuary. Anywhere but those penetrating papal eyes that seemed to see straight through his existence to the cold, truth lying beneath. The congregation sensed the psychological battle unfolding before them. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through autumn leaves. Isabella's grandmother clutched her rosary beads, her weathered fingers moving in silent prayer for reasons she couldn't name. The wedding photographer, confused by the unexpected drama, lowered his camera, uncertain whether to capture this moment or respect its growing gravity. "Look at me, my son." Pope Leo XIV's voice carried the gentle authority of a confessor, but underneath lay adamantine steel. It wasn't a request, it was a command wrapped in pastoral care, delivered with the quiet power of someone who had guided countless souls through their darkest revelations. Marco's head turned as if pulled by invisible chains. When their eyes finally met, the truth passed between them like an electric current that made the very air shimmer with impossibility. The Pope's weathered features registered no surprise, only the terrible certainty of a man confirming what he already knew to be true. Isabella felt the tension radiating from her groom-like heat from a forge. "Marco," she whispered, her voice tight with growing alarm. "What's happening? You look terrified." But Marco couldn't speak. Under Pope Leo XIV's unwavering stare, his throat had closed completely. The man who had charmed Isabella's family with stories of his theological studies, who had convinced everyone of his devotion to serving God, who had seemed so perfect in every way that man was dissolving under the weight of papal recognition. Pope's eyes never left Marco's face as he spoke to the congregation, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "Sometimes, beloved children, God places us in moments where the impossible demands acknowledgement, regardless of how it challenges our understanding of his divine order." Marco's legs felt like water beneath him. He gripped the altar rail to keep from collapsing, but even that small movement seemed to confirm something terrible in the Pope's mind. "Tell me again," Pope Leo XIV said softly, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority, "how you came to possess that cross." Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, his papal robes rustling against the marble like whispered judgments from heaven. Itself, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, seemed to converge on him, casting him in an almost ethereal glow as he faced the trembling groom. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his office, not loud, but absolute, cutting through the cathedral's silence like a blade through silk. "Tell me, Marco Benedetti," the Pope said, each word measured and deliberate, "how is it possible that you stand before this altar when I personally administered your last rites 3 days ago?" The question detonated through the basilica like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the congregation as 300 guests processed the impossibility of what they had just heard. Isabella's bouquet slipped from her nerveless fingers, white roses scattering across the altar steps like fallen stars against the dark marble. "What?" Isabella's voice cracked with disbelief. "What did you just say?" Marco's face drained of all color, his skin taking on the pallor of marble statuary. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a man drowning in air. The trembling in his hands spread throughout his entire body as the weight of divine recognition pressed down upon him. "Your Holiness, Father Benedetto," stammered, stepping forward with confusion written across his elderly features. "Surely there's been some mistake. Marco is very much alive, as we can all see. Can we?" Pope Leo XIV's interruption was quiet, but devastating. His dark eyes never left Marco's face as he continued. "Because 3 days ago, I held this young man's broken body in my arms after a bus struck him down outside these very walls. I felt for his pulse and found none. I closed his lifeless eyes with my own hands." The congregation erupted in confused murmurs. Isabella's father pushed forward, his businessman's logic struggling against the impossible. "This is absurd. You're suggesting my daughter's fiancé is dead. Look at him, he's breathing. He's standing here." But Pope Leo XIV raised his hand. For silence, his papal ring catching the light like a beacon of truth. "I am suggesting nothing, Signor Romano. I am stating fact." He took another step closer to Marco, close enough that his next words carried only to the groom's ears. "The question that torments me is not whether you die. No, you did. The question is, what stands before me now, wearing his face?" Marco's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed to his knees on the altar steps, his wedding suit a stark contrast against the ancient stone. Isabella reached for him instinctively, but something in his expression, a flicker of something inhuman, behind his familiar features, made her hesitate. "Marco," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell him he's wrong. Tell me he's wrong." But when Marco looked up at her, his amber-flecked eyes held depths that seemed to stretch into eternity itself. "I remember the darkness," Marco whispered, his voice barely human as it echoed off the cathedral's ancient stones. The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession torn from the depths of hell itself. "I remember the cold, and the ... the nothingness." Isabella stepped back as if struck, her white wedding dress rustling against the marble steps. "What are you saying, Marco? What are you talking about?" But Marco's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were seeing through layers of reality that shouldn't exist. His hands pressed against his temples, fingers digging into his scalp, as memories that belonged to death itself began flooding back. "The bus," he continued, his voice growing stronger, but somehow less human with each word. "I felt my bones shatter. I felt my skull crack against the cobblestones." Pope Leo XIV watched with the terrible fascination of a man witnessing the impossible unfold before his eyes. "Continue, my son. Tell us what you remember after that. After." Marco's laugh was hollow, echoing strangely in the sacred space. There was no after. There was only the void, and then, his amber eyes fixed on Isabella with an intensity that made her soul recoil. And then there was her. Her love called to me from across the threshold between worlds. The congregation had fallen into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that comes when the natural order reveals its hidden cracks. Father Benedetto clutched his prayer book so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while Isabella's family huddled together as if proximity could protect them from the supernatural horror unfolding before them. "Love doesn't raise the dead," Isabella said, but her voice shook with uncertainty. "Marco, you're scaring me. You're not making sense." Marco rose slowly from his knees, his movements fluid in a way that seemed to defy human anatomy. When he smiled at her, something flickered behind his familiar features, something vast and ancient and hungry. "Doesn't it, cara mia? Your grandmother always said love was the strongest force in creation, strong enough to move mountains, to part seas, ... His voice dropped to a whisper. "Strong enough to tear holes between life and death." Pope Leo XIV's face had gone ashen as theological implications crashed over him like a tide of darkness. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his office. "What manner of abomination wears this young man's face?" Marco's head tilted at an angle that was almost but not quite human. "I am what love creates when it refuses to accept loss, Your Holiness. I am what happens when grief becomes so powerful it reaches across the veil and drags back what was taken." Isabella's hand flew to her mouth in horror. No, this isn't real. This can't be real." "Real." Marco's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed slightly too sharp. "I'm more real than I ever was in life." Marco's confession poured out like blood from a mortal wound, each word more devastating than the last Tuesday afternoon, 3:15, I was walking back from confession at Sant'Anna when the number 64 bus ran the red light. His voice carried an otherworldly calm that chilled everyone present. I remember the impact, the way my ribs folded, inward like paper, the taste of copper filling my mouth as my skull split against the stones. Pope Leo XIV's face had gone gray as ash, as the terrible memories flooded back. In his mind, he could see the scene again with crystalline clarity. The crowd of horrified pilgrims gathered around the broken body, the driver weeping over his steering wheel, the way the young seminarian's amber eyes had stared sightlessly at the Roman sky. "They brought you to the Vatican morgue," the Pope whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible truth. "I performed the examination myself. Your spine was severed at the third vertebra. Your heart had stopped beating. Your body temperature was dropping toward ambient." Isabella's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank onto the altar steps, her white dress pooling around her like spilled milk. "This isn't happening," she breathed. "People don't come back from the dead. Not like this." But Marco's smile was serene, terrible in its inhuman tranquility. "I lay in that cold room for 18 hours, Isabella, 18 hours of nothing. No thoughts, no dreams, no awareness. Just the absolute silence of death." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "And then I heard your voice." "My voice?" Isabella's words came out strangled, disbelieving. "You were praying for me in the chapel above, begging God to bring me back, to give us more time together." Marco's eyes found hers, and in their depths she saw something that made her soul recoil in terror. Your love was so pure, so desperate, it created a crack in the wall between worlds, and something answered your prayers. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, his papal authority radiating like heat from a forge. What answered? What came through that crack? Marco's head tilted at that inhuman angle again, his familiar features shifting slightly, as if something vast was struggling to contain itself within his stolen flesh, something that has been watching, waiting, hungry for a foothold in your sacred realm, something that needed a form you would trust, a face you would love. The temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications crashed over them. Isabella's breath came out in visible puffs as she stared at the thing wearing her beloved's face. "You're not Marco," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat like pieces of her soul. "You're something else, something that crawled into his corpse." The smile that spread across Marco's face was answer enough beautiful and terrible, and utterly wrong. The thing wearing Marco's face stood slowly, its movements too fluid, too graceful for mortal flesh. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from somewhere far beneath the cathedral's foundations. "Do you want to know why I chose him? Your Holiness. Why this particular vessel was so perfect for my purposes." Pope Leo XIV's hand moved instinctively to the crucifix at his chest, his decades of theological training warring with the supernatural horror before him. "Speak your purpose, demon. What do you want with the church?" "Demon," the entity laughed, and the sound echoed strangely through the sacred space, as if the very stones were recoiling from its presence. Such a limited understanding. "I am something far older, far more patient than your simple devils." It gestured to the terrified congregation with Marco's familiar hands. "I am what feeds on faith itself." And this place, it spread its arms. Wide, encompassing the entire basilica, is the richest feeding ground in all creation. Isabella pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out the voice that sounded so much like her beloved's, but carried undertones of cosmic malevolence. "Stop it! Stop using his voice." The entity's attention turned to her with predatory focus. "But cara mia, it was your love that made this possible. Your pure, desperate prayers created the perfect invitation." Its smile was Marco's smile, but wrong in every conceivable way. A seminarian about to be ordained, beloved by a faithful woman. Mourned by the Holy Father himself, what better Trojan horse could I design? Pope Leo XIV's eyes blazed with righteous fury as understanding dawned. The ordination. You intended. To be ordained as a priest, tomorrow morning, I was to kneel before this very altar and receive holy orders, the entity confirmed, its voice rich with anticipation. Imagine the irony, a creature of the abyss, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, administering sacraments. How many souls could I corrupt from within the Church's own heart? The congregation erupted in horrified whispers, but the entity's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. And it would have worked perfectly, if not for Isabella's inconvenient timing. Her love was so consuming, so desperate, she couldn't wait even one more day to bind herself to me in holy matrimony. Father Benedetto stumbled backward, his prayer book falling from nerveless fingers to clatter against the marble. "Blasphemy," he whispered. "Absolute blasphemy." Is it the entity tilted Marco's head with that unnatural angle? Or is it simply the natural consequence of faith pushed to its breaking point? Isabella's love was so pure, it tore a hole in reality itself. I merely stepped through. Pope Leo XIV stepped protectively in front of Isabella, his voice carrying the full weight of apostolic authority. "By the power of Christ, I command you to release this vessel and return to the depths from whence you came." The entity's laughter was like breaking glass. "Commands your holiness from you. You forget was invited here by love itself." Isabella sat motionless on the altar steps, her grandmother's wedding dress now stained with tears and the weight of impossible truth. The woman who had awakened that morning as a radiant bride was disappearing before everyone's eyes, replaced by someone hollow and lost. Her dark eyes stared at the entity wearing Marco's face as if seeing the depths of hell itself, which she realized with crushing clarity. "She was 2 years," she whispered, her voice echoing in the cathedral's vast silence like a prayer to a God who had abandoned her. 2 years of love letters, of planning our future, of dreaming about the children we'd have. Her hands trembled as she pulled off her engagement ring, the diamond catching the morning light one last time. All of it a lie. All of it manipulation. By something that feeds on faith. The entity reached toward her with Marco's familiar hands, and Isabella recoiled as if touched by fire. "Isabella, my feelings for you are real. This vessel's love, his memories, his devotion, I carry all of it within me now. Don't—" The word exploded from her lips like a gunshot, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Don't you dare speak of love. When you're wearing his corpse like a costume, don't you dare use his voice to tell me lies." Her family moved to surround her protectively, but Isabella stood slowly, her wedding dress hampering her movements as rage began to replace horror. Every kiss was a deception. Every "I love you" was bait for some cosmic trap. Every moment of happiness was just you feeding on my faith like a parasite. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Isabella's world crumbled in real time. Her mother wept openly, while her father's face was stone, his businessman's mind struggling to process a reality that defied every natural law he understood. "How could I have been so blind?" Isabella continued, her voice rising with each word. "The way you never spoke about your childhood, how you flinched whenever we passed accident sites, how you sometimes spoke as if you were watching me from a great distance." She turned to face the entity fully, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. "You were studying me, weren't you? Learning how to be human by mimicking the man I loved." The entity's expression flickered, and for a moment something genuinely sorrowful crossed Marco's stolen features. His love for you was the strongest emotion in his dying mind. It was illuminating. "Stop!" Isabella choked out. "Stop wearing his face. Stop using his voice. If you have any mercy at all, show me what you really are." The entity's smile was heartbreaking in its familiar sadness. "But cara mia, what I really am would drive you mad. This face, this voice, they are my gift to you." Marco's last gift preserved in perfect detail. Isabella's legs nearly gave out. As the full horror crashed over her, "You're telling me you're keeping him prisoner in there? That some part of him is still conscious, watching you parade around in his body?" The entity's silence was answer enough. Pope Leo XIV rose to his full height, his recent frailty falling away like discarded robes as divine authority filled him with supernatural strength. The tremor that had plagued his hands since his cardiac surgery disappeared completely, replaced by the steady power of a man who had dedicated his life to combating darkness in all its forms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2,000 years of apostolic succession. "Enough?" The single word reverberated through the basilica like thunder from Mount Sinai. "You have revealed your purpose, abomination. Now face the consequences of your blasphemy." He pulled his PayPal ring from his finger, kissing it reverently before raising it like a weapon forged in heaven itself. "By the authority granted to me by Christ Jesus, I begin the rite of exorcism." The entity wearing Marco's face snarled, its carefully maintained human facade cracking as supernatural fury blazed in its stolen eyes. "You think your rituals can bind me, old man? I was not summoned by incantation or sacrifice. I was invited by love itself. Pure, desperate, faithful. Love that created a crack in your precious cosmic order." "Love can indeed move mountains," Pope Leo XIV replied, his voice growing stronger with each word as he began the ancient prayers. "But love corrupted becomes something far more dangerous." He gestured for Father Benedetto to join him, and the elderly priest stumbled forward despite his terror, clutching his prayer book with white-knuckled determination. The cathedral's air grew thick and oppressive as spiritual forces beyond mortal comprehension began to clash. The stained glass windows rattled in their ancient frames, and several candles flickered out despite the absence of any wind. The congregation pressed together in terrified huddles, their collective prayers rising like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. "You want to know my true plan?" the entity hissed, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "It was never about infiltrating your church through ordination. That was merely the appetizer." Its amber eyes fixed on Isabella with predatory hunger. "The real feast begins when I marry this faithful woman in your most sacred space, binding her soul to mine through sacramental bonds that even your God cannot break." Isabella's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. "The wedding ceremony, you want to complete it. Imagine, the entity continued, its voice rich with anticipation. A creature of the abyss united in holy matrimony with a devout Catholic, blessed by the Pope himself in St. Peter's Basilica. The spiritual contamination would spread like plague through every sacrament, every prayer, every act of faith connected to this union. Pope Leo XIV's prayers intensified, Latin phrases flowing from his lips like liquid fire. In Nomen Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I command you to release this vessel and depart from this sacred ground. The entity laughed, but now there was strain in its voice. Your words have power here, I'll grant you that. But you forget, don't need to win this battle, Your Holiness. I only need to survive long enough to speak to simple words. Its gaze locked on Isabella with terrifying intensity. I do. Isabella stood at the crossroads between love and damnation. Feeling the weight of the entire spiritual realm balanced on her next words, the entity wearing Marco's face watched her with predatory anticipation, while Pope Leo XIV's exorcism prayers created a barrier of sacred power that made the very air shimmer with divine energy. But in that moment of supernatural chaos, something extraordinary happened. A flicker of genuine humanity crossed the possessed features, and Isabella heard a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. Bella. The word escaped Marco's lips like a prayer torn from his soul. For just an instant, the entity's control slipped, and Marco Benedetti himself looked out through his own amber eyes with desperate love and infinite sorrow. Don't let it use me to hurt you, the entity snarled and reasserted control, but the damage was done. Isabella had seen the truth. Her beloved was still in there, trapped within his own corpse, forced to watch as something monstrous wore his face like a mask. The revelation shattered her heart and gave her strength in equal measure. You want to complete the ceremony? Isabella said, her voice growing stronger as she stepped closer to the altar. The entity's eyes blazed with triumph, but Isabella's next words stopped it cold. Then let's complete it properly, with the truth. Pope Leo XIV watched with growing understanding as Isabella's true plan revealed itself. She wasn't surrendering. She was choosing to fight with the only weapon the entity couldn't defend against. I, Isabella Romano. Clearly through the cathedral, despite the supernatural storm raging around them, take you Marco Benedetti, not this abomination wearing his face, but the man I fell in love with, the seminarian who died 3 days ago to be my husband in life and in death, in this world and whatever comes after. The entity recoiled as if struck by lightning. No, you cannot marry a dead man. The sacrament requires love. Isabella interrupted, tears streaming down her face as she spoke directly to Marco's trapped soul. And my love was strong enough to tear a hole between worlds, strong enough to give this monster a foothold in our reality. Now let that same love be strong enough to set you free. She pressed her hands against Marco's face, looking past the entity's malevolent presence to the man she knew was still inside. I release you, my beloved. I release you from my grief, from my desperate prayers, from the love that became a chain. Binding you to this horror, Marco's features flickered between human and something vast and terrible as the entity fought to maintain control. You don't understand what you're doing, it shrieked. Without the anchor of your love, I cannot maintain this form. I know, Isabella whispered, pressing her forehead against Marco's. Goodbye, Tesoro, rest in peace. The light that erupted from Marco's body was blinding, filled with 2 years of genuine love finally set free. The light that erupted from Marco's body filled St. Peter's Basilica with radiance that seemed to come from beyond the physical realm itself. As the supernatural illumination reached every corner of the cathedral, the entity's agonized shriek dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only silence and the lingering scent of roses, Marco's favorite flower, the one he had brought Isabella. Every Sunday during their courtship, when the brilliance faded, Marco Benedetti's body lay peacefully on the altar steps. His features, finally at rest, no longer animated by either demonic possession or desperate love. The terrible tension that had twisted his familiar face was gone, replaced by the serene expression of a soul finally free to journey toward whatever waited beyond the veil. Isabella knelt beside him, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled starlight as she pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. Sleep now, amor mio, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a love that had learned to let go. "Your suffering is over." Pope Leo XIV approached slowly, his papal authority now tempered with profound compassion as he looked down at the young seminarian whose death had become an unexpected battleground between heaven and hell. The pontiff's weathered hands moved in the sign of the cross as he began the prayers for the dead, the same prayers he should have completed 3 days ago in the Vatican morgue. "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord," the Pope intoned, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral, "and let perpetual light shine upon him." The congregation joined their voices to his, in a chorus of amen that seemed to cleanse the very air of its supernatural taint. Isabella's family surrounded her with quiet support, her mother draping a shawl around her shoulders, while her father stood guard with protective instincts. "What happens now?" Isabella asked Pope Leo XIV, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. The pontiff's smile was gentle, filled with decades of wisdom. "We honor the truth of what occurred here, my child. Marco's soul has found the peace it was denied by our grief. Your love was so pure it became a pathway for both darkness and light. Today, you chose light." As the cathedral began to empty, Pope Leo XIV made an unexpected announcement. "You spoke vows that transcended death itself, witnessed by God and this congregation. If you wish it, I will bless this union not between the living and the dead, but between a faithful woman and the eternal memory of love that proved stronger than the grave." 6 months later, Isabella stood in the small chapel adjacent to St. Peter's Basilica, where a memorial plaque bore Marco's name among the seminarians who had died in service to the Church. She came every Sunday to place white roses beneath his nameplate, no longer driven by desperate grief, but by grateful remembrance. "Do you think he knows?" Isabella asked Pope Leo XIV one morning as she arranged fresh flowers. "Do you think he understands that I finally learned to love him enough to let him go?" The Pope's smile was radiant with certainty. "My child, I believe he has known peace from the moment you chose his freedom over your own comfort." As Isabella made the sign of the cross and prepared to leave, she whispered a final prayer. "Thank you, Marco, for teaching me that the deepest love is the kind that sets us free."